Welcome to everybody. My name is Philippe Burin. I'm the director of the Graduate Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all for this roundtable organized in partnership with the UN, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, on the occasion of the International Women's Day. And this is a great day, with origins, as you all know, I suppose, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, when it started as a feminist and social movement in the United States, before being adopted by the Second International, the Socialist International, just before the outbreak of the First World War, and being officialized much later in the 1970s by the United Nations. As this historical reference makes clear, this is a tradition, this is a secular movement of which we are all part and which we are very honored and committed to continue, with the idea that a secular movement is not going to find an easy accomplishment in the coming weeks, years, or maybe in the coming century. I think this is a kind of call to arms for all of us, that even if the women's cause has made its way against many obstacles, it still remains a very long way for us to stop marching and to sit quietly contemplating a better humanity, one that would have fully understood that to leave half of the population at a disadvantage is a huge waste of intelligence and creativity. So, as an introduction, now let me turn to our panelists and introduce first on my left Kate Gilmore, who is the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. Kate has arrived in Geneva 2 years ago, and a number of us have already had the pleasure to see her playing different roles, but also talking to our audience. Before that, she was a member of Amnesty International, where she had the function of Executive Deputy Secretary General. To my left is Felipe Ruiz, Yaramilo Ruiz, who is a PhD student here at the Graduate Institute from Colombia. As I see, from Colombia to Finland, and then to the University of the Andes, and then to Geneva. So this is a perfect globetrotter. And Felipe is working on conflict resolution, governance, peace building, gender, human rights, and democracy. To his left, we have Ambassador Patricia O'Brien, Ambassador of Ireland to the United Nations in Geneva. Previously, she was Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs at the United Nations, and prior to that, legal advisor to the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland. Then we have Dr. Arzu Rana Deuba, a member of Parliament of Nepal, where she serves as the chair of the Women Parliamentarians Coordination Committee. She is a well-known gender activist and social worker, and she has worked on a number of issues, particularly in the area of reproductive health and rights. So here is our panel, and let me maybe start by asking a question to each panelist and have a short answer, and then have a second round of questions. So maybe let me ask you, Kate, why have we still to march? In other words, what did we achieve, and what are the remaining or maybe the emerging challenges that will come?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Graduate Institute for bringing us all together to celebrate this wonderful day, and happy International Women's Day, each and every one of you, men, women, children, and everybody in between. It's an honour to be on this fantastic panel, and a privilege to join the conversation. I wanted to suggest that we march for three reasons. One, to commemorate those who marched before us. Secondly, to defend against regression for those who would attack us today. And thirdly, to prepare the way for those who will come behind us. An important responsibility, given the number of young people alive today is greater than ever before in all of human history. And we owe them an inheritance of the kind from which we benefited. If you think about what is this that we commemorate? Thank you. So we commemorate, for example, the women who marched to Versailles in 1789. And they marched actually against rising prices in the rising price of local commodities and staple diet, grain. It was the women marching to Versailles in the first instance, thousands of them, then joined by blokes. It's a technical term in my country. Joined by blokes, men, less culturally specific. Joined by men, that eventually led to the king abandoning Versailles, coming to Paris to be in touch with the people. Voila, the French Revolution. Unwritten stories of women's contribution. Actually, in 1917, in the context of the Russia liberation or revolutionary movement, women marched in the then Petrograd, and they marched for suffrage. Actually, they marched under the banner of, can you believe it, bread and peace. And they marched for, again, decent living wages, access to decently priced common goods, and importantly, to universal suffrage. It was their marching, then joined later by blokes, that led to the Russian Revolution. In 1956 in Pretoria, women marched under the heinous regime of apartheid against the race-based so-called pass laws. It was women who marched first and most powerfully, leading such a demand for transformation of that heinous regime that eventually it had to be quelled with what has become known and tragically known as the Sharpeville Massacre. Women marched. And actually it was in Argentina, only thanks to the mothers of the plaza. Yeah, you know what I can't. I've got it written down. I was trying to get through this without looking at my notes. Mothers of the plaza. Who marched from 1976 to 1983, each and every week. Marched for the disappeared. In fact, unless those mothers had marched, exposing and denouncing what the junta was doing to shore up its power and its regime, we would have all been continued in the delusion in which the international community was indulging, by the way, that somehow this was a credible government. It was the persistent weekly march. We owe them at least one march a year, I tell you. Brave women who went before us, who stood not up only for their rights, but stood up for the rights of those about whom they cared deeply, and they stood up bravely and courageously at great risk to their own well-being. So I think we also march not only then in commemoration, but because of their legacy. That's a tradition, that's a culture of marching that we have to carry forward. Today we march because just in the last year there's a government which decided, when introducing laws on violence against women to retain as mitigating circumstances to reduce penalty a judgment as to what she was wearing and what were her morals in more general terms. There's a government who introduced laws to weaken sanction against child marriage because in some circumstances it was deemed by that jurisdiction that marriage is in the interest of the child. Children, bearing children in the interest of the child. This was the proposition. There's another government who has decided, in the face of all that it's implicated in, including in the global arena, sponsoring interventions in other countries where conflict is at its gravest, that government felt that it had time to decriminalise violence against women, provided it occurred in the family and didn't do any injury. There was a government who's decided that actually we shouldn't invest in sexual and reproductive health for women, imperiling the lives of not only potentially 300,000 women around the world who otherwise will die of preventable causes in pregnancy, but also 2.9 million newborns who will never see their lives through to their first month. So there's plenty of reason to march today. And I hope, as we march today against the regression, including, if I might just add, the European parliamentarian who felt it necessary to point out that women actually should be paid less because, you know, we're smaller. He clearly hasn't meant me. Or my thighs, I might say. Because a member of the European Parliament who said, oh no, they're smaller, they're weaker, and they're dumber, less intelligent, another bloke, I might add, and therefore should be paid less. There's plenty of reasons to march today, to stand on the shoulders of those who marched before us and because of all those who will come after us.
So, Felipe, you have conducted research on the peace process in Colombia. What was the role of women in that peace process, and what difference did they make?
Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm actually very happy to participate here today. Quite intimidating after this intervention. So I hope I do well. So today I kind of wanted to share a story of hope, which is the story of Colombia. Because what just happened in Colombia with the peace process answers many of the questions we're trying to answer today. The reason, why are we marching? Why is it important? And why are we still marching? Because if you answer the first question, why were women marching? The answer is obvious. Women were not included in the peace process when the peace process began. When the negotiation began with the FARC in August of 2012, no woman was present in the negotiating table. There weren't any women participating in the negotiating table. It took more than a year, until November of 2013, for the government to assign 2 women as main negotiators. And it took until June of 2014, more than 2 years, to generate the subcommission on gender. So why did it matter? The second question. It mattered because it made a difference. If you analyze when the gender subcommission was created, 3 of the 6 points of the table had already been agreed upon. And if you compare the drafts to the final agreement, when the subcommission was created, the vision of the gender perspective transforms the agreement as a whole. And lastly, why are we marching? Well, you all saw the results of the plebiscite. Many opposed. And gender was a key issue of why people opposed to the peace agreement. And women are marching so that the consecrations and the achievements made so far are not taken aback, so that we continue advancing in this struggle that I think with every new victory, which is the story of hope in Colombia, comes new challenges. And that's kind of what we're living today.
Thank you. Patricia, a very different question, one I find particularly exciting. Within society, where does the resistance to women's right come from?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you on this very important topic, on this very important day for all of us. I thought that I would answer this question by first contextualizing it from my own personal perspective, because it caused me to think on my own personal experience and where I have seen the resistance and how I would identify that resistance. I'm a lawyer. And when I was born in my country, I wasn't actually born in my country, but at that time, there were no women police in the country. It was completely prohibited. When I started practicing as a lawyer, it was not possible for a woman, if she was married, to join the civil service. This ban was removed a few years later, but the most memorable issue for me was when I started practicing as a barrister at the Irish Bar. Within a few weeks, I was presented with a case of criminal conversation. So those of you in the room who have studied the common law, you all look far too young to me to even know what I'm talking about. But for your illumination, criminal conversation was a concept in the common law whereby a man was entitled to sue another man who had enticed his wife away from him. In other words, putting it more simply, if a woman had an affair, then her husband could sue the man with whom she was having the affair, even though she had consented completely and had indeed run away with the man. So she was completely outside the picture, and the husband was entitled to claim damages for 3 different torts. One was criminal conversation, or as we knew it colloquially because it was relatively common, crim con. So if somebody ever asks you, have you indulged in criminal conversation, do be very careful how you answer the question. The second is harboring, the second is enticement, and the third was harboring, all of which gave rise to significant damages. We're talking about 1981. So in 1981, this legislation was taken off the books. But those of you who come from common law jurisdictions, this was a part of your law for some significant time. Unfortunately, in my country, a little bit longer than others. However, we're proud of the fact that it's gone, along with a lot of other issues that were particularly egregious. So time has moved on, and the resistance undoubtedly is still there in so many ways, in so many areas, but there is improvement, unquestionably, since those times, and I speak, as I say, for my own experience. My other personal observation is the question of, or the issue of, how women are listened to or not. Women have achieved positions in significant places. There's no doubt there's been enormous improvement in that area. Not enough, but there has been improvement, not least in the United Nations. But I think there's we all think, I'm sure, in this room, that there's a real difference between achieving quotas, achieving numbers, achieving statistics, and finding ourselves in environments where we are listened to in the same way that men are listened to. I found myself in the United Nations often in a room where it was the fact of being a woman in a particular role was referred to as a specific achievement. And for me, it was, that in itself was egregious to identify, because the implication was that you wouldn't have got the role if you hadn't been a woman. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that, unfortunately, it created the impression that the reason that you're being listened, or that you've got the job, the reason that you're being heard is very different to actually being listened to. And there was no doubt in my mind as time went by that the voice of a man would very often be listened to differently to the voice of a woman. And it wasn't a matter of conveying what one wanted to say in aggressive terms or male-like terms. It was simply the fact of being a woman. And the more the men would perceive the woman to be womanly, the less the resonance of her voice. So it's a very, very complex area, but I think that that is something that we need to talk about more, is how important it is to listen to women in the same way without that sense of difference or filtering that can apply. Another point I wanted to make is the very broad point, just to sort of stimulate the conversation later, is the question, since I've touched on it, of quotas. And I mean, we've seen here in Geneva over the last while references made to trying to get women into senior positions and how important it is, which we all espouse and believe in. But I remember when the discussion was going on, particularly about the Secretary General, that I read a wonderful quote to the effect that there will be no gender equality until one has as many incompetent women in leadership roles as we have incompetent men. No pejorative reference or innuendo there to men, but, and I'm not specifically speaking about the Secretary. But there is something in that, because I noticed throughout the discussion, including from my own voice, that what we wanted was the best, because we need the best. And that was, I think, the most persuasive argument on the gender issue in the context of that very important appointment, that we wanted, the world needed the best we can get. And I don't, in that context, subscribe to the theory that basically any woman would do. But it is, as long as it's a woman, it is a very tricky subject, and this question of affirmative action. So I do think we should spend a little bit of time maybe talking about that. So the sum of the resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. I was hoping to hear something about the Catholic Church, but maybe we will come back later to the topic, instead of having this completely overdue focus on Islam. Arzu, let's change a bit the focus here and ask you if there have been changes in demands from the woman, that is, in women's demands, and how is, in particular, the legislation in Nepal capturing the tensions and demands that come from the civil society about women's rights?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really happy to see so many young women and some brave men in the audience. And I haven't traveled that far today, but in terms of where I am sitting here before you, I think I've traveled many centuries to be here, because in my country, we live together in many centuries together. It's a very interesting kind of a time to be in, because I come here and I think, okay, I'm in the 21st century, I hear these excellent women talking better than most men. Then I go back to, to Nepal, and life hasn't changed in the last 400 years. So when we talk about demands changing, I always see as demands existing side by side. There are still demands for drinking water. There's still demands to learn about menstrual hygiene. And there are demands, again, to aspire to be the president of Nepal. And we have a president who's a lady in Nepal. And if you look at, how we are set out at the topmost echelons of society, we have a Speaker of the House who's a lady from a very backward tribe, from a country where, from an area which has the lowest human development indicators. But even the woman in a village who still don't know much about menstrual hygiene can now aspire to be a speaker in Nepal. So the demands have changed, but there's a different spin to the demands now, I see. It was just drinking water because my child wants purer water. I don't want infection. But now it's different. We still want drinking water, but I want to save time so I can study, I can become somebody, and I can aspire for things that I never dreamt of. So the demands are there. They all exist side by side, And when I look at the demands, sometimes it's very confusing. I go to a village and there are girls, still, cooped up in a little, like a chicken shed, when they have their menstruation. And then, I go to another village and there are women who come to me and they're more empowered than I will ever be. Because, they're in this village in the middle of nowhere, but the kind of things they tell me, it just blows me. I think, for the life of me, I could have never had a thought like that when I was her age and with so little exposure. But women have changed, and it's because we know the only way to go is up. We can't go any lower. So there's this great urge to be that person that you could never dream of. And I think that's how the demands have changed now. And as legislators, because in the last, Nepal has been through a very interesting time, but it's also a Chinese curse. May you be born in interesting times. And in my country, I was born in a very interesting time because we had 10 years of insurgency. We are still going under a transition phase. It took us 8 years, but we've written a new constitution. And we have tried our best to capture the demands that women have spoken about. We have, it was a very inclusive process. There were a lot of women from all walks of life, some of them totally illiterate, some of them could barely sign their names. Some had never seen a gas stove. Some had never even seen a toilet seat, but they came to parliament and they voiced, the experiences they had and the changes they aspired for. So some of the demands that we've been able to capture have been, we really fought for it. In fact, I put my whole career on hold. I was a development worker and my aspirations were maybe to come to the UN one day, but it's been since 2008, I've been a legislator in my country. And I thought, like till 2015, when we almost didn't have the new constitution, I thought I'd go into a depression because I said, what did I do in my whole life? I did a PhD, then I did this work, then, like I've spent 6 years and the result is going to be 0. Because that's what politics is about, 2 and 2 is never 4. You don't know what the result is going to be. But when we got that constitution, we, got like 2 things I think changed for the best. One is we were recognized as citizens of Nepal. And that was something which was like a miracle. To put the word that a woman does have the right to give her name to her child and the father doesn't have to be there. That was a big, big, big battle for us. Because our society is so patriarchal that when we are given in marriage, like we are almost literally given away, the father, I heard that with my own ears at my cousin's marriage, and I was really horrified. He tells the son-in-law, if you look after my daughter, you'll be blessed in heaven. If you kill her, then it's going to be a sin. And that's all. He washes his hands totally off his daughter. And, for that society to acknowledge that a woman is a full citizen and even she can have a child and say, this is my child, was a big battle. And mostly men of my age. The older men were more open-minded. I think, they already had their children and they couldn't care less. But but the men of my age and the younger men, they were very threatened by this, And we spent a lot of time across the board, whether it was extreme left, extreme right, people in the center. All of us felt this is something we have to do. We owe it to the younger generation, and we owe it to all the women who came before us and struggled. So that has been a big achievement. But still, you know, one other thing we were not able to achieve even now, you know, Nepalese men, if they marry women from anywhere in the world, their wives are entitled to a citizenship of Nepal once it is known that they have given up their homeland citizenship. But for the men, the husbands of the girls of our country who want to marry and be in Nepal, that doesn't count anymore. They've said you have to wait for 15 years. And, you know, and that's really has been a big blow, because just to be a naturalized citizen from anywhere in the world, you can live in Nepal for 10 years, but to be the husband of a Nepali woman, you have to live for 15 years. So that's the kind of discrimination we are still facing. But our demands exist side by side, whether it's for sanitary pads or to become the president of Nepal.
Before giving the floor to the audience, let me maybe ask to the panelists the same question, and I'm going away from the script here, which is the nice part of the role of moderator. I think it's pretty clear that the main problem is the men. So let's suppose that you find a way to to educate them. It will be a long-time process. It will be a long-term process. So in the meantime, what would you say are the two main resistance to women's rights? And so fixing priorities and then telling us what you would recommend as actions to overcome those two main resistances. So Kate, as you are well seated next to me, I think you should start.
Yeah, you know, I think I'd like to nuance it. I think there is a deep age gap here. My own sense is of some optimism for the younger generation of both men and women. I think if I look at the demography of power, of influence, and the demography of those who make decisions that are of consequence in the world, I think it is still very much in the hands of men, but I think they're aging men. And I think the younger... I think they are. You can tell I'm trying to be. It doesn't suit me to be subtle. Doesn't flow very sincerely from me. But you know, old blokes. I'm just saying that I think the new generation, the younger generations, have a lot more security amongst themselves. In terms of owning gender and identity, appreciating diversity, negotiating intimacy, expecting to see women in places outside of the home. I know it varies enormously across countries, but for me it gives us real hope, which then means a very practical challenge actually, is how do you accelerate transfer of influence to that generation? And here I think we have a really strategic challenge, because it is just the case that we're in the midst of one of the greatest demographic transformations in human history. It's just true. And actually it's got a number of dimensions. More people on the move than ever before. More people living in urban centres than ever before. More interconnected. Information travelling at speed of light for the first time in human history. More educated, actually, than ever before. But two important things. There are more younger people than ever before and more older people than ever before. And forgive me if I'm repeating myself in front of colleagues who've heard me say this before, but I think it is important to notice that the demography of a Europe with its privilege and its anxiety as compared to the demography of a Uganda, a Yemen, a Central African Republic, or a South Sudan. The median age of Uganda, 15. The median age of Niger, 15. The median age of Yemen, 16. The median age of South Sudan, 17. The median age of Central African Republic, 17. The median age of Iraq, 21. The median age of Syria, 23. The median age of Germany, 47. 15 to 47. The median age of parliamentarians, 53. I'm sorry, but power, privilege, opportunity is getting older and more afraid. Poverty, despair, exposure to conflict, deprivation of assets is young, so young that in fact many of today's wars are the wars of children. But it's hidden in plain sight. And for me, it suggests that if we really want a transformative agenda, then where is it in public policy that we are problematizing the absence of intergenerational dialogue? We have pre-conference youth meetings, we have youth panels, we have peer-to-peer conversations for young people. But I'm sorry, until we breach this intergenerational gap, and frankly, #handed over, I don't think there can be the transformation that you're challenging us to identify. Sorry.
Felipe, from your work on the peace process in Colombia, what would you say were the main resistances to the inclusion of women? Just men in power, anonymous processes, in the sense that you have things that have crystallized over a very long period and that are more than just the mentality of the old male.
Well, I tend to agree with Kate. I mean, it's a generational, but also it's the men in power. If you look at the Colombian case, it's kind of curious that even though we have Security Council Resolution 1325, we have CEDAW, we have the advances of the Constitutional Court. In 2012, this is a peace process that began 4 years ago. The government started a peace process without women. It didn't even come into the discussion. So why is this happening? And I would just make one comment. Numbers matter. Colombia has one of the lowest number of women participating in parliamentary bodies in the Congress. If you look at the Constitutional Court, it's mostly made up by men. So who's making the decision? That's why at the end, the Colombian case, regardless of, we could have Security Council resolutions. We could have laws. But if we don't change the composition of these bodies to make them more balanced, this male masculinism will continue and will be replicated once and over again.
Patricia, I'm not asking you to overstretch the craft of the diplomacy, but maybe what is, in your view, what need to be changed in priority?
Well, thank you very much. Speaking from the perspective of a diplomat and many colleagues here, working in this environment, I think that Geneva is particularly fertile ground for making progress, to be a little bit more positive, making progress on these issues. I mean this, of course, across the spectrum of the various organizations with which we work here, but in particular comes to mind, of course, the Human Rights Council. And just to give a sense to those of you who aren't so familiar with the work of the Council, which is currently in session, there are a wide range of measures which are constantly under debate, threat, etc., with which we work on a very regular, relentless basis, such as elimination of discrimination against women, accelerating all forms, or to eliminate all forms of violence against women, the right to nationality, women's equal nationality rights in law and in practice. We have various working groups on the issue of discrimination against women and the Special Rapporteur on violence against women. And this is the sort of tip of the iceberg. So there are a wide range of issues that are being addressed in the Human Rights Council. But I think the issue that's really of interest is the fact that we all know that there is a really, the Council itself is a very polarized environment and becoming more and more so, sadly and unfortunately. So the question that we have to ask ourselves every day is, how can we address that increasing polarization? And there is no easy answer, and there are very, very many questions around it, and very many answers and very many layers to those answers. But I think that we can't really lose sight of the importance of sustained, continual, principled action which is underpinned by a commitment to dialogue, to continue to discuss these issues and to be open to listening again, listening to all sides, and to give a sense of being able to listen instead of coming head to head on a daily basis with the issues. I think there are other ways, as we would say, there are many ways to skin a cat, which is a pretty horrible metaphor, but anyway. There are different ways, and I think that these are being deployed, but it's a very difficult uphill struggle. I had an example yesterday, not in the Human Rights Council, but in the conference on disarmament, because I chose to make an intervention, partly because it was International Women's Day today, and I chose to focus, apart from North Korea, on a number of issues, focused obviously on disarmament. And I spoke to a number of the secretariat and the panel beforehand and said, look, I am going to talk about gender. And there was this unbridled sigh from a particular member state of the conference on disarmament, which was sort of, did create in me a sense of, oh no, I'm going to bore them because it's going to be gender. And then I realized that my reaction was so frankly Irish, to say, oh dear, well, oh, maybe I should just focus on arms and nuclear business and never mention the disproportionate effect in the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear detonation. And then, of course, it took 2 seconds and I went for it and doubled what I had intended to say. But that is a different context. But people would often wonder, well, why? There's so much to be said about nuclear disarmament. Why would you waste the space talking about gender issues? Of course, if there's a nuclear detonation, it's going to affect everybody. It's going to be so devastating. Why waste your time at this stage talking about gender? My belief is that we need to talk about gender in all the issues that we're dealing with, not just the specific ones that I've referred to, but that in a sense, gender equality should be the prism through which we see so much of what we're doing on a daily basis at work. Thank you.
Arzu, I think we would be interested to know what the effect, the influence of UN bodies or international law or the role of NGOs have on the ground in a country like Nepal. Is that a force for change, or is it one more reason to resist change?
Well, I have some good news for you. There is some good impact of the UN in countries like ours. In fact, in Nepal, the women's movement was very much driven by outside forces. And of course, it took a life of its own. But initially, I remember way back in 1985, when I think we celebrated the International Year of the Woman. Was it 75? Or it was 75. 75 to 85. That decade did a lot of things in Nepal. In fact, I think that's how my own awareness about women's rights grew. And that time it was still, absolute monarchy in Nepal, and women were just meant to be seen and not heard. We had a queen who was just supposed to look good wearing her crown and just smile benignly and wave her hand. But she took up the issue that long time ago because she had to come to Kenya, I think, to do something. Or that was after the 10 years thingy. And then she decided, okay, I have to look good, So then that's when they introduced for the first time something called the rights of women, the rights of daughters if there was no son. And that's the first time any girl child who was born to parents who didn't have a son had any right to property. Prior to that, everything would be given to the uncle's son. And because in my own family, I had seen my aunts suffering penniless because their marriages hadn't worked, but they could not access even a single penny of the mother's or the parents' inheritance. So it did make a change, and it sounded a bell to all of us, and we all woke up and said, oh, there are rights for women. We never even heard about it, though we did have the vote. But what did it really mean for us? It just meant, you go and vote where your husband says to vote, or where your father-in-law says to vote. But to actually think, I have my own rights, I think it was the doing of the winds of change that came about. And of course, 1990, when you had, the Berlin Wall falling down, we had changes in Nepal as well, which were political changes, and women made the difference. And of course, UNICEF, UNDP, UNFPA, they all stepped in and told us, way to go. And I remember the conference of the girl child in 1989 in Nepal. That was my first job as a translator. And that's when I read about the girl child, but it made a lot of noise. And the winds of change that are driven by countries outside has made a difference, and especially now with media. There's so much happening all over the world, and nobody is left behind. Everybody has smartphones, even in Nepal. All the women have access to so many things and information. And I think, and we all watch very carefully. And for us to tell our governments, there's a report card. You have to go to CSW, we have to report to CEDAW, we have to report to the Human Rights Convention. It makes a difference. And our judiciary has also, taken up these things quite strongly, and they've said, and the good thing is our governments go and sign everything. So once they sign, then it gives us a lot of space to say, you signed, now you have to do here. It takes pushing, but it does happen. And that helped us a lot when writing the Constitution as well. A lot of women's groups would come and they'd say, this has been signed by Nepal. And we have to go every year. And, either you show up and be embarrassed, or you do the things. So now in Nepal's constitution, we have done a lot of things based on what the international laws are. And I'm happy to tell you, madam, that Amnesty International also had a very significant role to play in Nepal, where laws for women were concerned, where laws for inclusion were concerned, where getting rid of discrimination was concerned. And I think even for that much, even though Nepal is a poor country, I'm so happy we pay that fees, whatever it is, to the UN, because it looks out for us. It looks out for the people who are almost voiceless. So I'm very happy to say that it does make a difference.
Thank you to all of you. We have a bit of time for questions from the audience. So there are micros around. So please give your name and ask short questions, please. No micros? Here.
Yes. My name is Leila Heiss, and I'm a student at the Institute and a feminist.
All are.
Yeah, good. Not afraid to say it. Some say that more women should be hired and their advancement should be promoted because they have qualities that are specific to their gender and that make them more effective in a business or in an institution and that benefit the whole institution. Do you agree with this statement idea, or do you think it is sexist to assign some specific qualities to a gender? Thank you very much.
Is this a question addressed to somebody in particular, or
anyone who feels inspired? Thank you very much, by the way, for all your remarks. Very inspiring. Thank you.
who wants to? Yes, please, Patricia.
I think that's a great question. I volunteered because I thought it was such a great question, but I think that it's causing me to think. I think that there is some validity in this, that there can be very little doubt that women bring to the table, to some extent, a different set of ingredients. They bring similar in some ways, usually in skills and expertise, but in terms of emotional intelligence, I'm not saying one sex is more emotionally intelligent than another, but it is a different type of emotional intelligence at a certain level. And I think that having women's emotional intelligence at the table can help to progress, not just in international relations, peacemaking, and all of the sort of work that we deal with here. I think this is undoubted in the business environment. And that if you have women at the table who bring that different perspective, you can achieve more by combining it with the male emotional intelligence. And it's not easy to specifically say, this is what it is. It's like a wonderful painting, you know it when you see it. It's there in the room, but you can sense that a woman very often can bring a stronger sense of certain ingredients that add value to the general objectives. So I do think that that is something that should be recognized and something that we ought to think about. Thanks.
I have two words: Margaret Thatcher.
Okay. Maybe let's take a few questions and then we will ask everybody to answer. There's here. Yes, I've noticed. So.
John Quinn, I'm the Australian PR in Geneva, and I'm old. I'm not sure I'm brave, so I've taken on board the comments of the panel. But thanks for a wonderful set of presentations. I joked last year this is a good model for interactive dialogues in the Human Rights Council. So with that comment, let me say just two things. First of all, I think there is an embedded conversation about what a modern male is that we do need to talk about. That has been a process, as colleagues may know, a barbershop conversation about how men react to these issues. And I think there's really an issue, and I'm an optimist like Kate about the younger generation, but I think for young men to figure out what the role model is quite a challenge, as a personal comment. I was going to ask about economic empowerment, though, and I think one issue that Australia is very focused on. We're focused on violence against women and peace building, peacemaking, decision making. But I think we've figured out that if you have a job and an income, it empowers you. And I think we're very interested in the panel's thoughts on how women can be economically empowered, because if they have the wherewithal to live, they can move on, they can advocate, they can move forward. And with the younger generation, girls are doing so well at school. How do we translate that into the capability dividend that I think that Philippe flagged at the beginning, and to make the case that we need women in the workforce? We're somehow missing out on this huge capability. How do we break through this barrier? Women do well in the informal economy, not the formal economy. There's a future of work out there. There's a digital world. How do we actually, picking up Kate's third question, what legacy do we give girls? Because I think there's a real question about how we break through this barrier. There's something going wrong between capability and the workforce. How do we work on that issue? Thanks.
Two ladies there. Yes, I've seen them. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the wonderful organization. Daphne Gönenç, I'm a PhD student at the Institute, and I have a question to Ms. Gilmore. Well, it's a pessimistic question. unfortunately. You know, let's go to Saudi Arabia for a minute. It's probably one of the worst ranking countries in the world in terms of respecting women's rights, but it is the country which imports most of the oil in the world. So how about starting a mobilization against Saudi Arabia and stopping importing oil tomorrow onwards altogether? You know, we all pay fees to United Nations, as you said. So how about United Nations leading this mobilization? Are we ready for such a mobilization as a world?
Hi, my name is Chizzy Tara, and I'm here at the Institute as well. And my question is, from my country, Nigeria, a lot of the gender discrimination that I've faced has come from women, women who have been educated, women who are not educated, and it just makes me question, like, how can you achieve gender equality if the women who have been educated, women who are not educated, women from all walks of life who are against gender equality, like, what can you really do? Because it just seems that in Nigeria, it's a lot about bringing men to the table, but we don't bring the women, and a lot of the women are against gender equality, so... I mean, not a lot, but I mean, people I've spoken to, like my mom's friends, other people, you know, so what happens next?
Okay, we deal with those 4 questions and then we make another and final round. So, who wants to start? Maybe Kate? I mean, you answer the question that seems to be most interesting to you.
I don't think that question was asked yet. No, I mean, I'm only joking. Look,
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, the Saudi Arabia. I'm going to try to come around to that via. Look, I think part of the challenge is that we don't have a set of metrics in economics and in labour and in contribution to gross domestic product that factors in the contribution of women. And so there's a hidden economy about the ways in which women contribute to the strength and the prosperity and, in fact, the stability of their societies. And there's some trillions of contribution here that can be converted into real assets, particularly for countries that have young populations. There's a demographic dividend in a young population, provided there's education, provided there's sexual and reproductive health, provided there's equality and justice. So I think this is the point that the wonderful ambassador of Australia, John Quinn, was making, who is my ambassador and who I really appreciate, and I really want to say thank you. Thank you. Particularly because I had to go at older blokes, you know, it's really bad. So there's no doubt that there is a real logic here, an extraordinary, compelling economic argument in the interest of all of us, if only we would get our act together. So the question does come back to, both in the context, interestingly, of countries with as much opportunity and as many challenges as Nigeria on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand, exactly what are we afraid of? What are we afraid of? It is not unusual for the group who is disadvantaged to buy in to the model that disadvantages them. In fact, some of the feminist theories talk about the internal map of patriarchy, and that in fact patriarchy requires our complicity to a large extent for its influence. So I don't think either your mum or her friends are a surprising phenomenon in this. I think the question is, how do we keep raising the consciousness and keep inviting them into a dialogue that helps them explore the ways, of course, in which they've been advantaged, but in the ways in which they have been disadvantaged. And many women, if you probe them about that, will start to speak of things that otherwise are unspeakable. Which brings me to Saudi Arabia. Maybe we should have a go at doing something with regards to oil in Saudi Arabia. But I want to challenge you a little bit on your theory of change here. And I think that's what it is. You're trying to isolate a means towards an end. I think somebody said, we learn from history that we don't learn from history. sorry, I don't know who said that, but a philosopher said that. But that being said, I think the one thing that is evident in history is that change has only come through social movements. It really has only come. Interestingly, historically, the power of student-led social movements. But it was women marching for women's rights that transformed that. It was those who'd been subjected to slavery and were descendants of slaves determinedly marching for the dream that Martin Luther King had that changed that. It was the students in East Timor, actually, who had an extraordinary influence on the liberation of that which is now Timor-Leste. And it was the young people in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere who brought us the Arab Spring. It was the older power who turned the Arab Spring into a very problematic winter for democracy. So you know, it's an interesting proposition. I think you're reminding us we need to check out our theories of change. We need to figure out the connection between what we can do and the destination we want. But it's the women of Saudi Arabia very, very bravely resisting inside Saudi Arabia, either through insisting on driving, for example, or more recently organising to resist the male guardianship laws that suggest that they need the permission of their male guardian to own property, to move in public space, to work and so on. Their resistance that is the real answer in Saudi Arabia, I think.
Somebody wants to add something? Yes, please, Philip.
I just wanted to add, I'll go back to the Colombian case, which is the one I know the most. But in regards to economic policy, very concrete, what was done in Colombia, if you analyze, one of the points of the agreement was agrarian reform. Before the gender subcommission was created, the only thing said in the agreement is to include a gender perspective. That's it. After the gender subcommission analyzed it, started analyzing the concentration of land and property rights in the hands of men. And it was women that brought that into the agenda and said, we have to change structural and historical inequalities. And who has land, who has property rights in Colombia has been traditionally men. So when the property rights were questioned, that automatically brought into the picture historical inequalities and ways of changing them today with a concrete measure, with the rural reform.
Thank you. Just want to add one brief, and it's a reaction to the question from our Nigerian friend. I think it's terribly important that we always ensure that men are included in the dialogue. And actually that makes me think that I would really like, and I think we would all benefit from hearing from Carsten Starr, who is the ambassador of Denmark, who's here, who always has an extremely strong and committed voice to this issue, as does John. It's wonderful when I speak for myself in my world here, we have and work with men who really are truly passionately committed to this issue because their voice is so important. But this leads me to respond to the Nigerian question, or the question, sorry, we're not in the Human Rights Council, from lovely lady from Nigeria. The issue of solidarity of women, I think, is something that we need to really also remember and focus on, because certainly throughout my life it has been something that I've been extremely conscious of. I suppose it was helped since a reference was made to Catholic upbringing or something or other about Catholic Church. Being a convent schoolgirl, the need at a very, very early stage to essentially join together and to stick with each other and to support each other. But it is astonishing to me, and I'm not a man, but I'm heading in the direction of the other part of that description. And I still am just utterly bemused how women can fail to support each other and to look after each other's interests on these issues. It just astonishes me. And I think this is something that we have to be so aware of, and that we shouldn't just do what I'm doing now, which is to pontificate about it, but to actually ensure that this is something that influences our activities and is a sort of moral check on us all the time. Is what we're doing, what we're saying, something that supports women or undermines us? Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to the question raised by the representative of Australia about women's capability and their apparent disappearance in the workforce, because that's something, you know, we ponder about a lot in Nepal as well. Women do excellently well, but they're never there in the workforce. And, you know, my own observation from working a lot on the issue of safe motherhood in my country is that women are never supported enough to become a good mother. And a woman, at least I'm speaking for myself, wants to be a good mother, and we have no second chance. You can't be second best mother. You have to be the best mother, otherwise your children are not going to survive. And that's how the human race goes on. But we tend to look at least in countries like ours, we tend to look at the child as only the mother's responsibility. And I know in your countries, you know, a lot of you know, progress has been made to support a mother when in her motherhood. But if that role can be, you know, supported more by wider society, not only government giving you things, but the men, the women, the larger family, the neighborhood, everyone also really chipping in to help that mother become the best mother possible, I think we would see more and more women in the workforce. Because I look, and it's, you know, something that really troubles me a lot, because I look at countries where your, you know, population rate is not being met, you know, the population replacement rate. Because the women there have become very smart, they work, they do everything, but if they want to give up that life to be a mother, then they're going to lose out. So what are they going to do? And you know, I live in the East, I get a lot of support, but I really wonder, and I'm totally amazed by the women of the West who have a job, who look after the children, they play a social role, they're traveling, I don't know how they do it. They have the best homes you go to. If I had to, you know, function under so much pressure, I would go crazy. No support. You know, but I know a lot of you here are mothers. I see some of them have brought their children here. It's so tiring. You need so much energy to be a mother. But the society thinks it's your responsibility. You are the mother. So you have to look after. So how do we change that perspective? And the only one thing I want men to do in this life is to be kinder to women. That's the only thing I wish for. If there was one thing people ask me, I would grant you, I would ask God, can you please make men kinder to women? Because I think that's what we do, that's what I see men doing. And also, of course, women, with the internal patriarchal things running in our mind. A lot of the mother-in-laws, and that's what I get asked, is the mother-in-law who's the most unkind to the daughter-in-law. But it's the mother-in-law who wants to copy the patriarchal system. So if we can be kinder to, and now we know with all the demographics I learned about today, about the average age of, you know, young people in this world, it better be a better world. It better be a better world for young women. Otherwise, we are educating them, we are telling them, go out here, here are all your other rights, here are all the positions you can fill, and then we're not helping them in the basic thing that they want to be. We have an instinct to be mothers. We're telling them, either you forget motherhood, you have a career, you can't have it all. So how are we going to create this world where both these things can be had? And that's going to be the big challenge for us.
So maybe a few last questions. The lady here, I'm taking only 3 questions. The lady here, and the ambassador here. Sorry, but we could go on for a long time.
Thank you very much. My name is Hendrika Okondo, and I work for the YWCA. And I think I was very impressed by Philip's presentation on Colombia. And also working in Africa, we look very much to Latin America, where we've seen a lot of progress, despite the heavy hand of the church. Because I work in faith communities. But I think the most important thing that you said was the fact that, you know, there was 1325, and yet the whole process in Colombia did not include women. And we've seen, I think, as Kate has said, the privilege and fear of the demographic of power. And we see that having really influenced, because we are seeing older men coming back into power. Okay. And the US is a good example. So we talked about a demographic of youth and change, but the older men coming back into power and using a strategy of fear so that even young men are voting because they want to keep their power. How do you deal with that? How do you transform power structures in that context?
Thank you. Here.
Hello, I'm Elena Hinkiewski, and I'm a professor of public policy from Simon Fraser University in Canada. And my question is a little bit different from some of the previous questions, and perhaps they're directed more towards the director of the Institute. In Canada, we've been focusing a lot in the last few years on advancing gender equality within our educational institutions. There have been a number of historic settlements for gender pay equity, and a lot of effort made to institutional changes, including incorporating gender equity plans, gender and diversity equity plans. And I'm really curious to know what's happening at the Graduate Institute.
Thank you very much. Now, I've been looking at the podium all night, and I can see one man with a whole bottle of water, and I can see the women panelists sharing water. So it's a bit unfair, I know that, but it's striking anyway. No, my question is of course in a slightly different direction. I think the frustrating thing is, and Kate has been alluding to that, and Patricia and us also, we have all the evidence of why women basically shouldn't be marching anymore, and why we should have more gender equality. We have the economic evidence. We have the evidence that if we have women in corporate boards, the companies do better. We have women entrepreneurship. We have women political empowerment, participation in parliaments. It all basically adds to the quality and the wealth of societies. And we have the same in terms of, should have the same in terms of the family, that gender equality inside a marriage, inside a family, is a good thing for the family, for children growing up and so on. Why is it so difficult to translate that evidence to more solid backup by both men and women to this agenda? We've been talking a lot about alternative facts recently, and there are a lot of that alternative facts out there, but none of that is actually supported by evidence. So what makes it so difficult to basically to crash that barrier that we want to allude to, that we are normally an evidence-based society, evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based conversations, but at the same time it's so difficult to overcome that. Why is that?
Who wants to start? Okay.
Well, I'm just going to refer just from my own recent personal experience on this question of evidence-based. I mean, in a sense, it's quite, I have found in my work in the Council and in the Conference on Disarmament and in actually one or two other areas, that this polarizing that I was speaking about earlier, the two perspectives, if you like, at either end of the spectrum on gender issues, when underpinned by the argument of where is the evidence, it becomes extremely difficult to be persuasive. And I have begun to find, we haven't had this conversation, but I have begun to find very particular particularly, that when certain states want to stop progress on gender equality issues, they immediately use this tactic of where is the evidence. For example, on disarmament, where there is, thankfully, scientific evidence, actual empirical scientific evidence to show that there is a disproportionate effect on women resulting from nuclear detonations. That when I have tried to include a gender dimension, the argument that is put back to me is, where's the science? And it's coming from very predictable states. Where's the science? But luckily, we're able to say, well, here it is, page 1, page 2, page 3, and then the argument moves on. So my personal experience is to find that a quest for empirical evidence in this discussion can be very invidious. Now, it's not a great answer to the question, but it's something that I think should be included in the mix of how do we find, because a lot of it cannot be empirically proven.
I mean, this is, like just off the hat. But, looking at how change happens, there's a level of intelligence, you get information and you learn about it. But does it change you here? And that's change has to happen one person at a time. And there has to be a tipping point when there are enough people to say, okay, this is how we change. But it's very difficult to translate that evidence into change in your own attitude. And I think that's my learning from gender training. It's tedious, and you feel being very repetitive. But if you can, and it's also partly adult learning, I think, it has to be from the inside. Just, giving you evidence is also not enough in some instances. And I think that's why, like to push the issue from a gender perspective is never that easy. People understand at the level of intelligence, but to understand at the level of emotion is very difficult. I mean, just...
Well, thank you for the question about Colombia. It's a hard question to answer, but I want to end on a positive note. Not saying that we're ending, but so you all know that the plebiscite lost. It didn't pass through the votes. And one of the key issues was gender, the gender perspective adopted in the plebiscite. And women were very scared that they were going to be taken off of the agreement. What did they do? They camped in Colombia's central Plaza Central. Sorry. They camped in the Central Square. Thank you. They camped in Colombia's Central Square. These were young people camping for a month. And the main message was one: we are not going to move from here. You're not going to exclude us from the peace process. So this is not a remedy, this is not a solution, but for every advance, the message is clear: we're not moving from here.
Thank you very much again for the conversation. It seems to me that perhaps we're resolving that for the social change that we all long for to catch hold. Evidence is important, but it's not enough. It needs, it sort of needs a three-pronged approach, I think. Number 2 is participation. I think it matters enormously who holds the evidence and who advocates with it. So I think voice and evidence have to come together, because actually there's an enormous amount of evidence, and the World Bank has done extraordinary multi-year studies to establish the economic benefits correlation to gender equality. We do know there's been a multivariant, multi-year study of over 60 countries' approaches to comprehensive sexuality education. It actually does work. Like, we know it works. As you get more informed about sex, STIs go down, unwanted pregnancy goes down, even sexual violence goes down. So, and we know that most of the remaining maternal mortality and infant mortality can be stopped with low-cost, low-tech interventions, absolutely affordable, wanting only for political will. So for me, the evidence, even though I think we've, sort of almost caught, thank you, in the UN in a metricocracy, I don't think the evidence will work until we change voice and participation. And then the third thing, in other words, we need more women at the table to make it matter. I mean, power doesn't give up power easily. And power is amazingly resilient. It can be entirely irrational, quite comfortably. It can lie through its teeth. So rationality, I think, is only one part of it. I think that's difficult, actually, in the Western world, to understand the irrational basis to power and the irrational basis to the status quo, and the temptation to use rationality to destabilise it shouldn't be resisted, it's just insufficient. So voice and participation matters. But the third thing for me is values. So evidence, voice, and core values. And here I turn to one of my greatest sources of inspiration. And I'm going to quote directly from it. One of my greatest sources of inspiration, which is T-shirts. Which may explain. Equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. Equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not pie.
Thank you so much. There was a question addressed to me. If you would agree, I will answer you directly because we have to close our session now. You want an answer? Excellent. Okay. I will limit myself to 20 minutes because this is a topic which is very dear to my heart, as some of you may know. But what I would like to say in 2 minutes is that we are acutely aware of this question of gender parity. And I would say that obviously, as an academic institution, we practice equality of pay for everybody at the same level of experience, that is. We have one structural problem and one problem of mentality. We have a structural problem because we have 60% of our students, graduate students, who are female, and we have, let's say, 25% of our professors who are female. So that's a structural problem which does not come from intention, but comes from the situation of the professorial body across the world in our disciplines, which means that when we open a position at the level of senior professor, then we receive 65 to 70% of male applications. When we open a position at the level of a junior professor, we receive about half-half. And so we have decided, with the help of a foundation board where there is parity of men and women, we have decided to have a two-pronged approach to redress the situation. First, to open more positions at the rank of junior professor, which means that now we have hired a majority of women's colleagues. And second, to make nomination by invitation to senior female professors. So by working on the two ends of the demographic scale, and I don't know of any other example, probably because I have not looked at it quite sufficiently, but I do not know any other institution having this practice of using the hiring mechanism to redress the gender balance. The mentality problem is that as we have a heavily male-populated professor body, we have to constantly remind them that they must be proactive in giving a chance to their female colleagues. And this is why, as a member of the Geneva Gender Champion, I've decided that there will be no all-male panels in this house. And I think maybe with one exception, we have stuck to this. And now, and this is why, you know, this is a problem for rich people in the sense that we only have a mortality problem which will be overcome, because in the end, if you have a policy and if you have somebody to apply that policy who is obstinate, then people change their habits. So this is a short answer to your question. What I would invite all of you is to go upstairs to have a glass of whatever you prefer, offered by our gender center, our center of gender, because we also have a center of gender in this house, and we owe a lot to Lisa Prügel and our collaborators for this. Thank you so much, and join me thanking